What do you, Ms. Squassoni, make of the recent announcement from the DPRK side, North Korea, talking about a new nuclear test? What could that be? What could be the nature of it?
Well, that's a great question. There's really no way of knowing. I would say, though, that the last test, which Kim Jong-un said was of a hydrogen weapon, a thermonuclear weapon, most experts pretty much agree that it likely was not. So, you know, this is, like much of the rhetoric coming out of North Korea, posturing. Certainly, if they tested again, that would prompt another round of responses, not just from the U.S., but from allies, because it's increasingly risky or threatening for them to conduct these tests.
Mr. Yang from China, do you agree with what Ms. Squassoni said, the nature we do not know, and if there is, likely more tensions, sanctions?
Yes, we have no hard evidences to indicate the real nature of the nuclear test. However, any kind of new nuclear test will obviously make a new round of tensions escalation. Especially, I'm very concerned about the in short term. Many people say, oh, it's another rhetorical threat by saying new nuclear test. However, if you look at the record of the DPRK, I always say it this way: if they say something relating to launching war, don't care about that. Most of them are rhetoric. However, whenever they say some threatening word on capability of nuclear or missile, we have to pay special attention to what they said. So now that their top leader have said, you know, they will have a new nuclear test, even, you know, combined with the delivery means, then we have to be careful to follow the situation, that whether or not they will do something more dangerous, I will say yes.
Professor Lee, what is your brief judgment?
Well, I believe that, you know, Kim Jong-un, who is the leader of a very small country in terms of GDP, has conducted the fourth nuclear test. He has threatened to annihilate New York City through his hydrogen bomb, and he has threatened the South Koreans and the Americans and the Japanese. This is perhaps one of the world's biggest security threats, and I am very convinced that Kim Jong-un, in the not too distant future, will conduct a fifth nuclear test, as well as other long-range missile tests.
So here comes the question, Professor Lee. Let's begin once again from you. Is there anything, or should there be anything, between Seoul and Washington, or messages between Seoul and Washington being sent out now to Pyongyang?
Well, you know, both President Park and President Obama have maintained, in my view, a very consistent line towards North Korea. That is, if they're willing to give up their nuclear weapons, as well as other weapons of mass destruction, we are always prepared, the U.S. and South Korea, to go back to negotiations, go back to the six-party talks, and to normalize ties to the DPRK. And so the real issue here is North Korea must show sincerity that they want to denuclearize their weapons, and then we can talk with them over a range of issues.
The question is, as the tension possibly escalating, at least from DPRK side, will others still do the same? Is that the wise things to do? Or there has to be even bigger pressure, heavier weight, or rather less, or seeking some kind of third channel in order to achieve something? Ms. Squassoni.
So I think what you really need to keep in mind is that there's a short-term gain and a long-term gain. So the short-term objective is really to avoid a crisis, to avoid some kind of inadvertent escalation. For example, during these exercises that South Korea and the U.S. are conducting, you know, not to raise the perception of risk to a level where the North Koreans really freak out and start to take some military action. The longer term game, you know, this is such a complicated issue that we've been dealing with for 20 years. You know, one of the questions is, does the U.S. say to North Korea, which is one of its demands, yes, okay, we'll sit down with you and talk about a peace treaty before you give us your nuclear weapons? You know, I'm sympathetic to the view that a lot of what we've been doing over time hasn't really worked, at least not with this leader. So I think we do have to be creative. On the other hand, you know, in our recent diplomatic endeavors with North Korea, they haven't really budged a whole lot.
Right.
So they really have to be willing to give something up. You know, as Chung Min said, they have to show some kind of willingness to negotiate.
But now China has been talking very intensely about a balance between sanction and negotiation, at least some kinds of dialogue. Is that wishful thinking?
Well, it's ideal thinking, quite difficult to bring about. However, we have no any other more feasible ways. So that is the reality. And I share with our Washington colleagues' way of thinking, say, the short-term game, short-term goal and the long-term goal, say, managing the current crisis and achieving our shared goal, say, denuclearization. These are the different matters. On the current matter, I think the necessary pressures and the increasing necessary pressure are the must. And only on the enough pressures, then North Korea could reconsider their existing failed policies and their failed programs.
But you know, from the North Korean side, the North Korean leader, Mr. Kim, was trying to send a message exactly going opposite to what you have just said. He's trying to, in a way, saying we're not budging because of any UN sanctions. Even China joined the sanctions, but we are still not budging. We are going to test the next round, especially when the US and the South Korea are having such a large-scale military exercises near our border. So I think that's the message coming from Pyongyang. So is that going to be a vicious circle further ahead, or rather this is the time to talk about negotiation?
Well, in short term, no way for negotiation, no way for North Korea to show our South Korean colleagues say, show your sincerity about giving up the nuclear arsenal. So short term. However, in long term, the situation, the reality will make increasing pressures to force the Pyongyang regime reconsider their policies. So you mentioned, you know, they want to go ahead is one matter, but whether or not they can is another matter.
Right. Okay.
So that's the challenge question to Pyongyang.
All right, Professor Lee. Yes, indeed. For Seoul, it's more complicated matter than all the others because you're on the same Korean Peninsula. Meanwhile, we have also seen Seoul's policy toward DPRK across the border have been changing and varied at different times, sometimes much closer, talking about sunshine policy, sometimes much cooler because of realities. So, Professor, despite of the domestic political pressure, for a responsible leader from South Korea, looking at the long term as being mentioned by Ms. Squassoni earlier, what do you think could be some of the sensible steps on the surface or beneath the surface to be done?
Well, you know, the reality is over the last 25 years, all Korean governments, both left or more right or more center, have tried various policy options. But the key issue here is this. As long as you have that type of regime in Pyongyang, Kim Jong-un will never give up his nuclear weapons, and the nuclear weapons are closely tied to the nature of the North Korean regime. And so we've tried everything. We've tried engagement, we've tried sanctions, we've tried hardline policies. And so the key issue here is patience. The Chinese, the Americans, us, the South Koreans, and the Japanese have a critically shared goal, which is nobody wants war. We want a peaceful transformation. And the long-term goal is this. We want a unified Korea that is not a threat to any of our neighbors, and a unified Korea that can work well with all the great powers. And in my personal view, that can only happen if you don't have the current regime in North Korea.
And let's talk about what could be some of the little bitty minor steps that we can take. Would that be an idea? Or what other ideas could we have?
Well, sure, I'm all for flexibility.
I'm sure you are. You've been working on
but,
this issue so many years.
Yeah, and I'd like to see some progress. That would be helpful. You know, it's a very delicate diplomatic dance, right? Because Japan has certain equities, South Korea has certain equities, China has certain equities, and the US does too. So even though North Korea, in terms of its nuclear weapons capability, that those are really quite directed towards the United States, and so they might, you know, it might be useful for us to negotiate first from our perspective. You know, I think in some respects we should take what we can get in terms of an opening, because one of the problems right now is that we don't have any dialogue with North Korean leaders. We really can't tell what, you know, what's going on with this rhetoric. I mean, we have experts and we, you know, do analyses of, you know, how many times bombastic rhetoric has been issued after, you know, UN Security Council resolutions. But, you know, we really need to sit down, not just with Kim Jong-un, but the people who are surrounding him, who are the, you know, make up the center of powers. Yeah, I'm for flexibility. I don't have any, I mean, you could go in a lot of different directions.
Right.
But the key thing from the other side, from our side, would be very close consultations with all the parties about what those maybe separate or smaller conversations are producing.
Professor Lee, could that be a possibility? What about so-called the parallel approach? On the one hand, working on the nuclear issue, on the other hand, work on the peace treaty as a final goal. Can those two going parallel with one another, or at least begin one so that the other also has the hope?
Well, our government's position is very, very clear. We also want a peace treaty to formally end the Korean War that occurred in 1950. But the key issue here is a peace treaty cannot come at the expense of no forward movement on the nuclear issue. So we must make real progress on the nuclear issue before a peace treaty is signed. And as Sharon remarked, you know, one thing that I want to make sure to our listeners on the CCTV is this. When Kim Jong-un came into power 4 years ago, since then, he has purged more than 100 top officials of his own party and generals. He has killed his uncle. He has killed his defense minister. He has killed his chief of general staff. And so if you have a regime that is killing off your top generals, who do you really trust and speak to? That's a key question that the Chinese and the Koreans, we simply don't have an answer.
Mr. Yang, we see different sides. They come in with different historic background and therefore look at things very differently when it comes to perspective. But the goal is the same, to have peace and stability in Korean Peninsula.
And the denuclearization.
And yes, indeed. But what about the very little step that we can begin with? Is there any hope for the little steps?
Well, actually, a multiple way of talks could be the stepstone for the baby steps, even smaller and bigger and bigger steps. For example, when we face more serious challenge from North Korean nuclear provocative new activities, then the other 5 parties can sit together to coordinate our policies towards the shared goal. Now the dilemma is all of our parties share the same goal. However, we have not coordinated policies. So 5-party, one of the functions for 5-party talks should be coordinating policies among the 5. Just now we have field, different views or way of thinking among our three. So that the five. So I think the five party could be coordinate the policies better, so that engage with North Korea more effectively, and also by the same token 4, 3, even 6. That's the baby step or starting point towards the diplomacy for the solution.